So the government has ordered an independent inquiry into the lobbying work by former Prime Minister David Cameron on behalf of the finance firm Greensill Capital, which has now gone into administration. The review, to be led by the lawyer Nigel Boardman, will look into how contracts were secured and how business representatives engaged with government. Mr. Cameron, who has insisted he has not broken any lobbying rules, did say that he should have contacted ministers through, quotes, formal channels. Our economics correspondent Helia Ebrahimi has this report.
It's the next big scandal waiting to happen. I'm talking about lobbying, and we all know how it works.
David Cameron's words are rod for his own back as the Prime Minister caved into weeks of pressure over what's been described as the worst lobbying scandal in a generation. Today, Boris Johnson launched an independent inquiry to uncover any links between his former school buddy, the failed finance firm Greensill Capital, and the government.
There is an issue around sleazing government. The lobbying legislation isn't fit for purpose. It needs reforming. It's too weak. It allows, for example, a former Prime Minister to be an employee of a company, so he's not categorised as a lobbyist, even though he's lobbying.
Before he took office, this was Cameron's pitch.
The lunches, the hospitality, the quiet word in the ear, the ex-ministers and ex-advisors for hire, helping big businesses find the right way to get its way. In this party, we believe in competition, not cronyism.
But after he left Downing Street, it was Cameron who applied the quiet words in ministers' ears, the text to the Chancellor or drinks to win round the Health Secretary. In fact, he lobbied numerous ministers and civil servants to win Greensill access to taxpayer-backed loans, actions that critics say risk tainting the whole government with sleaze.
Clearly, these sorts of accusations of cronyism leave a bad taste in the mouth. And if they're left to fester, then it really can erode that trust. We have to ensure that no one can buy privileged access. That is not fair to other organisations who don't have prime ministers on their payroll, and it's not a way to run government. He knew well that what he was doing was not an appropriate way for a former prime minister to conduct himself.
After weeks of silence, Cameron released a statement last night accepting that communications with government need to be done through only the most formal of channels, so there can be no room for misinterpretation. And he conceded that there was legitimate public concern about former ministers, especially prime ministers, accessing government decision makers. But the gist of his lengthy statement is a defence of his role at Greensill, and ultimately, he says, I was breaking no codes of conduct and no government rules. The problem with the Cameron affair is that it comes off the back of discontent about PPE contracts being awarded to companies with cosy connections. I've spoken to a few of Cameron's former cabinet colleagues. They all accept that there comes a tipping point at which these revelations become corrosive to public trust. One source tells me that he would welcome a new code of conduct that would make explicit that all government work should always be done in writing. The scope of the investigation still hasn't been detailed by government, though this is the man who'll be running it, Nigel Boardman, a city lawyer who'll be tasked with answering some uncomfortable questions about just how deep the lobbying crisis goes.
Helia Ebrahimi reporting. Now, earlier I spoke to Dr. Hannah White from the Institute for Government and Lord Miners, who was Financial Services Secretary under Gordon Brown. Both were critical of the body supposed to oversee these issues, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, known as ACOBA. I put it to Lord Miners that nobody in government really has any interest in tackling lobbying.
I think that's probably the case, but I hope that the force of what has happened, the exposure of the Greensill scandal, which is one of the most significant financial scandals in the UK for the last 20 years, will force people to recognise that the involvement of a former Prime Minister was critical. I'm quite clear in my own mind that Greensill would not have happened on the scale that it did were it not for the involvement of the Prime Minister in giving that business credibility.
Has the main problem here been a lack of transparency, that actually we've never really known before, perhaps, what senior politicians were actually doing in retirement? Hannah White.
I think that's a really key point. The rules only work, the rules only have power if there's sufficient transparency. But if there isn't sufficient transparency, and we saw, in the case of David Cameron, he took up this appointment more than 2 years, so after leaving office, so he didn't have to declare it to and there was no other transparency mechanism because he was employed by Greensill rather than being a consultant lobbyist. There didn't have to be any transparency around what he was doing. And it's really, if we have a system which essentially has weak rules and relies on people to follow principles in public life, our Nolan principles, which are, are really an underpinning of our system, if they don't think that anyone's looking, then the incentive to act according to those principles is much, much weaker.
Lord Miners, 1995, Lord Nolan established a set of principles and rules. I don't know what happened to them, do you?
Well, they're regularly referred to whenever you apply for a job within the government sector, even to be a trustee of your local NHS trust, you're asked to recite the Nolan rules, but I'm not sure that they're fully respected in the behaviour of people. Now, David Cameron knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew it was wrong for him to be pestering not only one minister in the Treasury, but 3 ministers. He knew it was wrong that he was able to secure for Greensill 10 meetings with the 2 most senior civil servants in the Treasury. He knew it was wrong for him to have a private drink with Matt Hancock to lobby about contracts which the NHS was awarding in connection with COVID. And there's no doubt about it, because Cameron then goes on to say, well, I knew nothing about the Greensill's business. I wasn't on the risk committee. I wasn't on the audit committee. I didn't know anything about the business at all. Well, what were you doing, Mr. Cameron? Your job was to promote the business, and you were promoting it not because of your experience as a PR man with Carlton Television, but because of your standing as a former Prime Minister of this country.
Hannah White, that is the crisis that we're now discussing. What is the cure?
Well, there are a number of different ways we could go about this. I mean, the normal British way when it comes to responding to a crisis or a scandal is to tinker with the rules and to maybe add, to extend them in this way or to change them in that way. And, I think that would be a minimum approach, that we potentially beef up ACABA, we give it a link to Parliament so that its rules are owned by Parliament rather than by government, and we get it to report to Parliament, that we extend the time for which appointments have to be reported to ACABA and make that more compulsory rather than voluntary. You could also extend the registrar for whom, at the moment, consultant lobbyists have to register what they're doing, but in-house lobbyists don't.
You won't have seen it, but Lord Miners is shaking his head. Why, Lord Miners?
Well, yes, strengthen is the right thing to do. I think we should just be very clear. Former ministers are not allowed to lobby government. If they wish to make communication to government, they should do it through civil servants. They know, John, that is the mechanism to use. They shouldn't be using back channels and text messages to private cell phones. There should be a proper process.
Lord Miners, Hannah White, thank you both very warmly for talking to us. Thank you.